They were here before the first Europeans landed on these shores. Records suggest they welcomed the newcomers, even helped the Pilgrims survive that first winter and gain a foothold in this new world. Yet they were thereafter consistently dehumanized, marginalized, and forced from their lands, if not warred against, and pushed to the brink of survival. The first Americans, ahead on Wide Angle. Welcome to the second of my two-part conversation with Professor Melinda Maynor Lowery. In part one, we discussed some of the particulars of the Lumbee Indians of North Carolina, the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi. Today, we broaden our focus to think about Native Americans more generally, explore the ways in which our past finds expression through the present, and imagine a path into our children's future guided by one of this country's founding principles: equality. I hope you find our conversation engaging and illuminating. It's a wonderful pivot point to where I wanted to go next, ideally, which was talking about sort of what white mainstream society, government in the United States could possibly do. Yeah, prime ministers, I gather, of both Canada and Australia have both issued formal apologies for their government's colonial attempts to essentially erase the indigenous peoples in those countries. It may come as a surprise to many Americans that President Obama back in 2009 actually also gave an apology, but it was a little bit different, yeah? It was called the Native American Apology Resolution. Mm-hmm. I say people might be surprised because it was wedged in a defense appropriations bill. It was signed on a Saturday. There was no media around. Okay. Signed in private. So maybe you can speak to how important do you believe an apology is to allow the relationship between mainstream America, Native American nations to heal and have the potential of moving forward? And how important do you feel it is that the apology actually, needs to be public so that we see it and we have to register it in some way?
Yeah, if I'm channeling my Lumbee ancestors here, I'm saying it's not an apology that's needed, it's a reckoning.
Okay.
It's a way in which people who have perpetrated these acts of violence and if not themselves perpetrated them, benefited from their perpetration, right, have been privileged by that perpetration, to come to the table and to come to terms with giving up something so that this history can be acknowledged, can be seen and discussed openly without prejudice or judgment, but also just some truth-telling occur. Yep. And those are the elements of reckoning that I think go beyond apology to some of the healing that can take place in this country. In the case of the Lumbee specifically, and perhaps other Native communities, Native nations more generally, we also do a lot of that reckoning ourselves within our own communities. And so if you think about problems that are well known to most Americans of poverty, disease, lack of economic opportunity, lack of educational opportunity, those problems are not actually endemic to Native societies, nor are they foregone conclusions of Native existence. They can be solved, and Native people have the tools to solve them. And the federal government actually has a process through which a reckoning can be, if not all the way completed, can be at least started, and that's called federal acknowledgement. So the Lumbees as a community lack this particular relationship called federal recognition to the U.S. government, which means that while the U.S. government has said that we are Indian people, it has said that some of the funds designated for Indians because you're Indians can be afforded to the Lumbees, we lack a kind of government-to-government or nation-to-nation relationship with the U.S. And that government-to-government relationship gives tribal nations within the United States certain privileges and latitude that are not that dissimilar from diplomatic relations that other foreign nations are afforded when they come into relationship with the United States.
And I think, if I recall correctly, too, from my read of your book, Melinda, when the country was first founded, that relationship was effectively established, was it not? That Native American nations were thought of by the U.S. government as foreign governments.
Yes, that's in the Constitution.
Yeah.
So the few mentions of Native people in the U.S. Constitution give Congress the sole authority to negotiate with foreign nations and the Indian tribes, as phrased in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Lumbees, for a variety of reasons, have been kind of left out of that particular loop, mostly because the U.S. government never negotiated formal treaties or agreements with our ancestors. And so that we don't possess that nation-to-nation relationship based on treaty agreements like other tribes do.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's a policy and a process called the Federal Acknowledgement policy that provides for a kind of reparation to Native communities that the federal government and state governments have overlooked or taken land and other resources from. And federal acknowledgement it's a kind of reparation to Native nations who have not had treaty negotiations or another type of formal acknowledgement of nation-to-nation status with the United States. So it's a complicated process.
Yeah.
It's a fraught policy. I mean, there are definitely upsides and downsides.
Sure.
But one of the mechanisms for the kind of reckoning that I believe many Native people feel is necessary is to begin to fully acknowledge the nationhood status of groups like the Lumbees that have been typically left out of this conversation about sovereignty, about the fundamental governance right of our people to determine our own futures, away from and apart from the kind of oppression or discrimination that our folks have experienced over the past several hundred years. Federal acknowledgement is a way to move that discussion forward to really provide Native Americans with the opportunity to determine their own futures on a governing basis, as well as to initiate the types of reckoning that are necessary in local communities and nationwide for all Americans to truly fulfill the promise that was set forward at the United States founding.
Right. History, as you're well aware, is typically written by the victors, yes? By that means, of course, understanding for future generations is shaped. It can be certainly misshaped as well. How critical do you think it is to have Native histories written by natives, such as the books that you've written, for the benefit of all of us going forward?
Well, I think that when you have Native history written by Native people, fundamentally, it's no different than having American history written by American people. There are going to be perspectives and insights and sources that that relationship to community yields that a different type of relationship doesn't yield. So I would say in the case of my own work, my relationship to the community means that I'm probably seeking out different types of sources, or perhaps reading sources with a slightly different lens, say towards issues of family and place, than a non-Lumbee historian would. Does that fundamentally change the interpretation of the history? I mean, in some respects it does, right? Because I am seeing these sources through the lens of Lumbee's value on family and territory in a way that previous historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and others who have looked at our history have not had access to. So they have tended to see our history in terms of the category of race and how we've not fit into the kind of Southern racial hierarchy. But in my work, I'm able to look beyond race to other kinds of ways of identification to understand how Lumbees are actually making decisions in the past about the circumstances that they're facing. But fundamentally, the circumstances that they're facing are the circumstances that all Americans are facing. So if it's a struggle over social justice, if it's a struggle over religious freedom, if it's a struggle over economic opportunity, educational achievement, those are all of issues of concern to the Lumbees, just as they are to every other American. And when a historian is doing their best work, I think they are able to understand the kind of cultural assumptions and perspectives that any group is bringing to its history and to the documents that it creates, and it's able to read those sources through those cultural assumptions. One of the interesting challenges of Native American history is that relatively few of the primary source material is written by Native people. So in the case of the Lumbees, we have very few sources, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, that are written by Lumbees. They're all written about us. And so you have to read those sources with an understanding of Lumbee culture, with an understanding of what Lumbees themselves have valued and the particular kinds of experiences that they have borne, in order to kind of get something meaningful out of those sources. And so that does change the narrative a little bit. But moving into the 20th century, you have oral histories, you have government reports, you have letters to politicians, you have diaries and memos and organizational documents in many cases that are created by Lumbees. And so, and in the case of other tribes, other tribal members. So you've got a much richer source base that I think most modern U.S. historians simply need to kind of look to and tap into when they want to start to figure out how a period like the Cold War affected Native Americans, or what Native people had to do with the promotion of the Cold War or life under the Cold War. Cold War historians simply need to look at sources written by Native people to understand a unique perspective that would, in some cases, might change or shape their narrative differently, but would certainly add a richness to it that would help students of U.S. history have a more complete picture of their past. And I think that's our goal. Whether you're Native or you're not Native and you're doing American Indian history, our goal is to really give a more complete picture of the United States past, as well as a real meaningful value on the distinct sovereignties of these Native nations themselves.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. For information about this episode or to view other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle.
For viewers, Melinda, who are interested in getting a different perspective on Native American peoples, on Native American history than perhaps they learned in school, a sense of resources that they might turn to?
I would think that
certainly your books.
Well, right. There's things for readers, and then there's things for folks who follow on social media or consume their news in other ways. I mean, certain mainstream news outlets like Democracy Now! Always do a really good job of covering American Indian issues. The Standing Rock pipeline conflict, they were very involved in that. There's a wonderful website blog called Native Appropriations, which really kind of plugs people into contemporary cultural issues and how they are resonating with Native people. There's a terrific web series on YouTube by a comedy troupe called the 1491s. So let that sink in. The 1491s is the name of the comedy troupe. And so I'll often show their videos in my classes to introduce my undergraduate students to just a 180 perspective on what American life means from various Native perspectives. The 1491s are a group of comedians, who come from a variety of tribes, and they just approach American life and American history with a really distinct, wonderfully funny and entertaining lens.
Great.
I think there are some other really good books that accomplish this sort of a similar goal of giving a new perspective on American history through a Native American lens. One of them would be Elizabeth Fenn's book, Encounters at the Heart of the World, which is about the Mandan people in the Northern Plains, and way beyond their encounter with Lewis and Clark, which is what they're typically known for. She provides this long history of the Mandans and their really critical roles in the development of the entire continent. I mean, apart from simply the United States, looking at how we got here today is completely different when you see it from a Mandan lens. I think that there's a wonderful film series on PBS called We Shall Remain. That was a 5 or 6 part series that covered various different episodes in American Indian history, from the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock to Tecumseh and the War of 1812, all the way to the 1970s and the takeover at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, that really help as a whole help folks understand American history through Native American eyes, with also a deep appreciation of the various tribal perspectives that are so critical to understanding Native life today. I mean, we can talk about Native Americans as a group in many respects, but the meaning is quickly lost when you lose sight of how these groups are, in fact, 500 different tribal nations that currently continue to occupy this territory. And We Shall Remain does a particularly good job, I think, about getting to some of that tribal nation specificity while also helping viewers understand its relationships to moments in American history that they already know.
Right. You recently had published in the New York Times an op-ed piece that speaks to the ongoing debate of Confederate statues in the South. It's a conversation that is typically framed as the racial binary that you spoke of before, between blacks and whites. You think of it as a Native issue as well, and certainly spoke to it eloquently in your op-ed piece. How so? How does it become a Native issue as well?
Well, if you consider the fact that Native people are the original Southerners, that we were Southerners before something known as the South even existed, everything that unfolds on this land has to do with us. Now, that's a little bit too broad of a generalization, but I would say that in particular, Native nations in the South today are facing issues that have their roots in similar phenomenon to the roots of the Civil War and the kind of debate that we're having over how we remember the Civil War. Right. So Native people in the South are not visible. They're not typically part of this conversation because the historical narrative has told other Americans that we were removed, that we were removed on the Trail of Tears, or that we were erased, or there are no Indians here anymore. Right. But the actual social political facts of that removal were that it was necessary to make way for the expansion of slavery and the cotton agriculture that the Civil War was eventually fought over. So without the removal of American Indians and the functional erasure of those of us that stayed behind, this slavery would not have expanded in the way that it did. The world would not have come to depend on the cotton that slaves farmed and the property values that slaves represented, and to such a degree that the South, or the Confederate States rather, felt that it needed to secede to protect its economic and property interests in slavery. It had the South remained this sort of, I'm engaging in a counterfactual exercise here that historians aren't very fond of, but bear with me. Had the South remained a kind of a triracial society where Indians were very much a part of and negotiating with Europeans and Africans, then the Civil War certainly would have taken a different form if it had happened at all. But Andrew Jackson and the interests of expanding democracy for white Americans insisted upon that removal. And it not only affected the tribes who were physically removed from the region, it also affected my ancestors who stayed, because there was really no legal or social category for us anymore. There were two types of people, slave or free. And we were not slaves, so we were going to be free, but we were also not white, so we were going to be free people of color, as opposed to American Indians with sovereign claims on our land and our people. So that sense of shared roots of our contemporary issues, I think, gives American Indians a kind of voice in how the Confederate cause is memorialized. They erased us from the picture before they had a chance to fight the war over slavery, but that does not mean that they can erase us again, as they erased the causes of the war when they put up monuments. So, the logic of the monuments, when they mostly were erected between 1900 and the 1930s or so, was that the war was fought over states' rights issues, that these were memorials to Confederate soldiers who died fighting for their land, when in fact the Confederacy itself was founded on the principle of racial inequality, and that the Confederate states were waging war against the federal government to protect their right to own slaves as property, to own people as property. But the monuments erase over that history completely. They effectively rewrite that history. And in the process of rewriting that history, they further diminish the role of Native people as they have persisted and stayed a part of Southern society.
Very good. One of the approaches I most appreciated in your book was sort of the parallel exploration, if you will, of Lumbee history alongside a developing U.S. history. Our origin stories, our unifying symbols. While the U.S. has, for instance, the Star-Spangled Banner, many people would be unaware that the Lumbee have your own anthem, Proud to be a Lumbee, written by your late husband, Willie French Lowry. If you would, tell us just a bit about it, as viewers are going to be able to hear it underneath the credits at the end of the show, and I want to encourage them to hang around and listen to it.
So the song, Willie wrote the song in the 1970s for Lumbee children as a way to have a kind of locally driven symbol that we could rally around and convey our values. The lyrics speak in a child's terms to the things that are important, not just to Lumbee children, but to all children, to be proud of who you are, to have your mother and father be proud of you. The lyrics go, my mother and father are proud of me. They want me to be free, free to be anything I want to be. And so that sense of freedom and independence are absolute core Lumbee values that when you're looking at American history, you can't escape them either. Americans have, or I should say, recent arrivals to America, are European, African, and other immigrants over time have taken those kinds of values and used them for their own purposes. Sometimes they've appropriated them away from indigenous people and used them to aggressively dispossess indigenous people. But indigenous people have consistently practiced freedom and consistently practiced independence, and even more so encouraged our children to embrace those ideals and pursue them for themselves so that we can achieve our own dreams. And that was the mission of Willie's song, was to not just send that message, of course, to Lumbee children, but to say to all Lumbees, this is who we are and this is what we've survived for. This is what we've hung around for, is to make sure our children can live by these values and be free to be who they want to be.
Right. Great. Melinda, I thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I thank you for the effort and the research devoted to the Lumbee Indians and American struggle, and I hope that it, like our interview today, offers an eye-opening perspective for people.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. I've really enjoyed it.
Good. I thank you. Near as I can tell, the job of every individual and organization is to grow and mature, taking advantage of the opportunity to stand on the shoulders of those who came before us and, well, do better, however we measure that. In the United States, our founders established what they considered self-evident truths as our measures. And the first of those was arguably the most important, that all men are created equal. Now, we can take issue with the exclusivity of that phrase, focusing as it does on men, just as we might confront the exclusivity practiced by America and Americans across the entirety of this nation's history, favoring some groups while disadvantaging others. But as vital as illuminating our failures is our commitment to advancing the principle that makes those transgressions so stark, that all men are created equal, be they black or white, straight or queer, citizen or immigrant, European or Native American. My guest over the past 2 episodes challenged us to look at Native history in its own right, as well as a facet of U.S. history. And as individuals, as communities, as a nation, it's our job to, one, better what was done before. We can't undo our past, but we can grapple with it in the spirit of equality and struggle to more fully realize its hope and promise, near as I can tell. On behalf of Melinda Maynor Lowry, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.
I'm proud to be a Lumbee Indian. Yes, I am. When I grow up into this world, I'm gonna be just what I am.
The skin is brown, the hair is black. I love the whole lot of looking back. I can be anything I want to be.
I can be a doctor, a lawyer, an Indian chief.
Yes, I can.
When I grow